So, what are the five things that you believed 10 years ago that have changed, that you've changed the stance on?
Okay. First, thank you so much, Harry, for having me on. I'm a huge fan of yours as well. Let it be known. So we're gonna get into it. What I've changed my mind on over the past how long?
Over the last 10 years,
10 years. Okay.
or even 20,
So
what
10 to
wasn't.
20. Okay. 20 might be a little better.
Sure.
Okay. So I used to believe that there was a post-exercise anabolic window of opportunity wherein you needed to consume quickly absorbed protein and carbohydrates, like typically within 30 to 60 minutes of the training bout. Otherwise, the claim was that you would be uh, not only compromising recovery, but compromising your gains. And the claim was that the timing of these nutrients was even more important of their actual existence in total across the course of the day. And so I used to believe that, and that was what was pumped out in the lay literature, and also in the academic literature. And so what happened over the course of the decade or two since that claim was put out there was a series of studies were published that essentially refuted that idea. And my colleagues and I did a bunch of the modern research on that question that really kind of overturned the idea that there was this 30 to 60-minute post exercise anabolic window. And if you don't take advantage of it, your gains are not going to happen. So I used to believe that. And that's just simply not true. And one of the big fundamental reasons why it's not true is because after a resistance training bout, after a single bout of lifting, the skeletal muscle is sensitized to protein feedings up to 24 to 48 hours after the resistance training bout. And there's even one study showing that muscles are still sensitized to protein feeding up to 72 hours after a single resistance training bout.
Is
So
that on a,
it's
is that
not
on a
like you,
sliding scale, or I mean, is that and that sensitivity of muscles, I mean, receptive to protein feeding,
Mhm.
is that on a sliding scale that, a
Yeah.
post workout in
Mhm.
the first 30 to 60 minutes, it's like, let's say on a scale of 1 to 10, it's 10,
Mhm.
then it's 9, then it's 8, or it really doesn't matter so much
Yeah.
as muchness?
It is the muscle protein turnover actually peaks at 24 hours after.
Oh,
So
wow,
the
okay.
muscle protein synthesis side, as a result of resistance training, peaks 24 hours after, but the sensitivity to feeding diminishes over time. So it just happens to have an MPS peak at 24 hours afterwards, regardless of feeding or not. So the answer to what you asked is a little complicated. But the main thing to take home is that if somebody is on a regular feeding schedule where they're eating roughly 3 protein-rich meals a day, then they are going to be in the fed state for the majority of the day anyway. Not only that, they are going to have a certain level of hyperaminoacidemia going on through most of their waking hours if they're on a regular, typical feeding schedule. So people who consume breakfast, dinner, and lunch, and certainly if they consume protein at breakfast, dinner, and lunch, there really is no need to worry about this so-called post-exercise anabolic window. And so that turned out to be true as long as your total daily protein intake is somewhere at about 1.6 or 1.7 grams per kilogram of body weight and up. So as long as your total daily protein was roughly 1.6 grams per kg, which in pounds is zero point 0.7 grams per pound, then the timing relative to the training bout, it really has no impact on your gains. What does have some impact, at least theoretically, is that you do consume protein regularly through the day in a relatively even pattern rather than a skewed pattern. but that's a distant second in terms of the hierarchy of importance. Of first importance, right up here at the top tier, is get your total daily protein right. And for the goal of gaining muscle, that's going to be somewhere between 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, and a little bit more in certain scenarios that we can talk about. But once you've hit that total for the day, then you've covered like 90 to 95% of the game. And then if just eking out the last little bit for competitive purposes or for optimization purposes, then you can think about how you're going to distribute that protein intake through the course of the day. And like I mentioned, a spread pattern or an more relatively evenly spread pattern, like for example, 30 to 50 grams of protein consumed 3 to 6 times across the course of the day, as opposed to just having 1 or 2 big bangers of protein, in the course of the day. And so that is what we used to think. We used to think there was this narrow 30 to 60 minute post-exercise anabolic window. That turns out not to be true, especially when you consider that most of the research that generated that hypothesis was on overnight fasted trainees who were put through a glycogen depletion protocol. And then indeed, there was a post-exercise anabolic window for replenishing glycogen. And then they tested acute effects on muscle protein synthesis. They compared just different things like carbohydrate by itself, carbohydrate plus protein, carbohydrate plus protein and or amino acids. And then Ivy and Portman came up with this hypothesis that, okay, well, you need protein combined with carbohydrate within that 30 to 60 minute window post-exercise. That turns out to not be true anyway, because you can have this stuff, if you're in the fed state, then let's take a scenario, and I can point to one of the research studies my colleagues and I did to test out this post-exercise anabolic window theory. First, what we did is we did a meta-analysis of all of the relevant research on this topic. So there were 13 studies in our meta-analysis, and we pulled studies that compared protein timed conditions with non-protein timed conditions or with control conditions. So the protein timed conditions contained a protein feeding, at least one protein feeding that was within an hour of the resistance training bout. Those are the experimental or the treatment conditions. The control conditions were a minimum of 2 hours of protein neglect on both sides of the training bout. So we pulled all the studies that drew that comparison. And we got 13 studies, and we found that, once again, like I mentioned, protein timing did not impact gains in muscle size and strength as long as total daily protein was at about 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight or higher. And right. So that was kind of the end of that saga, but we just wanted to see if there was anything to this post-exercise anabolic window type of idea. And so the way that we tested it was we fed subjects 25 grams of protein immediately pre, and we compared it with 25 grams of protein immediately post-exercise. So this was our thinking when we were going into the design of the study. If there is this post-exercise anabolic window of opportunity of protein feeding, then it might be taken advantage of with a pre-exercise protein feeding instead of a post-exercise protein feeding. And this is because the time course of amino acid availability in circulation is not immediate right after you consume protein. So even with a quickly digested protein like whey, it still takes 45 to 60 minutes for blood amino acid levels to peak. And so we figured, okay, if there's this post-exercise anabolic window, we might hit it with an immediate pre-exercise feeding. So we tested both. We tested immediate pre-exercise, compared it with immediate post-exercise protein, and ran the experiment for a number of weeks. And in resistance trainees, there was no difference in muscle size and strength gain, whether you consume protein immediately pre-exercise or immediately post-exercise. And so the whole protein timing relative to the training bout thing was really a concern that just got degraded through the course of the research findings, including our own.